Richard Haass, how is this different from what you and I remember of our youth?
It is different, Tom, and it's different in worrisome ways. Yes, you have the rioting and the looting against a backdrop of injustice. On 68, you had some awful things, obviously, in terms of the assassinations and the rest. In 70, you had Kent State. What I think is different about this, though, is what you were just discussing. It's the backdrop of a public health crisis that's claimed the lives of well over 100,000 Americans, and we don't know how many more coming down the road, and against, 25% unemployment. So it's this combination of physical threat, economic threat, and now political division and violence. And it's the combination of the three has got to have people worried about where this country is and where it's heading.
You and I remember the speech of LBJ on a Sunday evening years and years ago. It was widely presumed we would see the president speak last night. He and advisors chose not to. What would you recommend as the next step for President Trump?
Well, it seems to me he should only speak if he's got something that's healing and reassuring, and talks about not just Mr. Floyd, but essentially the lessons that need to be learned, in essence, the lessons that need to be applied about policing. He also needs to address public health concerns, economic concerns. Essentially, he has to step up to the moment, stop the divisive tweets, stop the personal attacks. Essentially, he should only speak if he's willing and able to rise to the occasion. But if he wants to use the occasion for political purposes or to deflect or to attack, then essentially less is more, and he should continue to stay inside the White House.
I'm wondering if you pair what we're seeing in terms of domestic unrest with the idea that President Trump withdrew from the WHO on Friday, something that absolutely has been evaporated from the news cycle. I'm just wondering if you can pair domestic unrest with U.S. isolationism. How does that sort of feed back onto the United States, the leader in the world?
Well, what you're seeing in the world is the United States is essentially abdicating. We haven't been pushed out of our traditional leadership role of the last 75 years. We have unilaterally taken ourselves out of it. We've withdrawn from more agreements, more arrangements, more institutions than I can count. So you've got that abdication of leadership, but on top of that now you have the demonstration effect, the example we're setting to the world of incompetence and ineptness in dealing with the pandemic. We're seeing this violence. We're seeing this violent police activity, as well as violence on the part of some of those who are protesting. So a big part of foreign policy is, or put another way, leadership has two dimensions. One is what your diplomats do, and what the president has basically said we're going to withdraw, and the other part of leadership is the example you set. And this is hardly an example any society in the world would want to emulate. So this is really about as bad as it gets.
Ambassador Haas, fantastic to have you with us. I haven't got through the whole of the new book, The World, an introduction just yet. But if there is a chapter in there on hegemonic power, have we ever had a reluctant hegemon, a hegemon that just steps away?
No, funnily enough, one of my previous books, many books ago, was called The Reluctant Sheriff. And I used the phrase to describe a previous president, but it applies much more to this one. And no, I can't find a historical example of a leading country in the world that voluntarily stepped down, not because of circumstances, but because of choice. When a country like Britain was forced to back off its leadership role, essentially it was forced. It simply didn't have the capacity, the resources anymore. It was too small of a country to sustain that role. But this is voluntary. And what's so worrisome to me, it's not as though we're stepping back, having put something better in its place. To, again, use a parallel to the domestic situation, it reminds me a little bit of the healthcare debate in this country, where we've repealed, but we've not replaced. And that's what I feel we've done in the world. We've repealed American leadership and the world order we helped bring about, but we've not put something as good, much less better, in its place.
If we had to rebuild that, Richard, what shape would that take? Because there are a lot of people like yourself, and I'm not saying these are your thoughts, but others share them, that maybe the world pulls back into two spheres of influence, with China at the epicenter of one and the United States at the epicenter of another. Is that something you can see happening? And what kind of institutions do we need to think about to actually see that happen, see that come around?
Well, I wouldn't want to see it happen by any means because China, to me, represents a model I would hardly want to see spread widely in terms of its authoritarianism at home, and given its much of its modern history. Now, is it possible? Yes, I think a more likely alternative to a U.S.-led world is a nobody-led world, where a world of greater unraveling, of greater violence, of a greater gap between global challenges and responses. What I'd like to see is not a unilateral American effort, but real leadership, which implies followership. The United States working with others, and by the way, including China, to deal with everything from proliferation to terrorism, to climate change, to public health, to regulate the behavior in cyberspace, and so on and so on. That, to me, is going to define the 21st century, and I would just say that after 2 decades, we are not off to a good start.